Thank you, everybody, for being here for the third annual Ethnic Studies Teach-In. We have had such a packed day of workshops and keynote speakers, a drum circle, a resource fair, and a lunch provided by Petra's. We are so excited to welcome you to the plenary panel, but first we'd like to collectively acknowledge that Cuesta College occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of both the Salinan and the Northern Chumash, who are the original, current, and future caretakers of the land upon we, as guests, work, teach, and learn. Dr. Sebastian Ferrada, they, them, is a faculty co-lead in the Ethnic Studies Department at Cuesta College. Sebastian earned their PhD in Chicano and Chicana Studies at UC Santa Barbara in 2019. At Cuesta, they teach Intro to Ethnic Studies for Educators, Intro to Queer Studies, and Intro to Chicanx Latinx Studies. They are currently working on a book manuscript titled Translate Me, Queer Latinx Familias and Belonging, which explores queer and trans Latinx families' experiences. Sebastian has published their work in the Journal of Language, Identity, and Education, Atzlan, a journal of Chicano studies, and the Oxford Handbook of Language and Sexuality. May I introduce our moderator, Dr. Sebastian Ferrada.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you. Hey, folks. Really excited to be here with you all. We're going to get started right now with the plenary panel. I thought it might be nice to have each of you introduce yourselves, share anything you'd like to share with the folks. There's folks on Zoom and the folks in the room. So maybe we'll just start here and go down the line.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane Hawley. I'm a teacher on special assignment working for San Luis Coastal Unified School District. And one of my main projects is rolling out our upcoming ethnic studies graduation requirement. I also coordinate our district's AVID program, which supports students who will become first generation college students.
Good afternoon. My name is Leslie O'Connor. I'm the secondary director for San Luis Coastal, and I have the privilege to oversee our secondary schools in San Luis Obispo, Morro Bay, Los Osos middle schools. I have the honor also of working alongside Jane and have done for many, many years. I'm very honored in that regard, and I'm pleased to be here. And I originally am from Ireland. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Chasman Brown. I've been an educator and school leader for 25 years in both San Luis Obispo County and other areas of California and Massachusetts. Most recently, I've been working as an educational consultant focusing on DEI and ethnic studies and disability inclusion. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So we have some questions for the panel today. It's not to be too strict. I mean, I think we'll go as the conversation evolves and flows. And of course, we'll have time later to answer questions from the audience in the room and also from the folks who are watching on Zoom. So for the first question, and anyone can go first, but the question I have for the panel is, can you discuss some of the core principles of authentic ethnic studies scholarship? Who would like to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think in my work developing curriculum for ethnic studies courses at the high school level, something that I've learned is so vitally important is to talk about local and regional connections and communities, to think about how we're being inclusive of communities of color who, are our students, and to represent their histories, to think about how to uncover those histories. There's a Slow High alumna named Emily Pan, who created an Asian American historical, database website for local Asian American history as a senior at Slow High. And so I think to leverage our students in not only learning the histories and the current lived experiences, but to also create those foundations of knowledge themselves for other students to build on is really important.
And working with Jane through our process in San Luis Coastal, it's been amazing as we've connected with community groups, the resources and the willingness to share and partner with us, all of those resources, and to give agency to so many people in our community. The model curriculum from the state level talks very openly about having that local connection and that local flair. And that has been an integral part of our developmental process in San Luis Coastal with our ethnic studies. And we've got to meet some fascinating people from all walks of life. I had the honor and privilege of meeting a professor who's currently teaching at Cal Poly who was a member of the Arab Spring, and we just got talking about that. Now, that was like 2 Monday nights ago. That opportunity was like out of the blue for me, and it was so appreciated to have that conversation, but all because of our work around ethnic studies.
Yeah, thank you both. When I was listening to you talk, I was also thinking that when we talk about ethnic studies classes and we develop them, that it's not just about the what, it's also about the how. So if these courses are going to be transformational and liberatory, we are looking at people's lived experiences. We are talking about how a classroom looks, feels, and is experienced differently by the students who are in it, so that their ancestry, their lives, their daily experiences, their values, their needs and concerns are part of what comes into the classroom. I'm also thinking about the Youth Participatory Action Research, YPAR, that's part of a lot of ethnic studies classes where students are connecting to their communities in really like deep, impactful ways. So they're designing ways that they can address problems that they see in their communities and build community connections and empower themselves in that way.
I think what I would add to that is I think so many of our students are excited about ethnic studies for those reasons, not only to feel seen and have a voice on their campus, but also to have a relevant and engaging education, like that sense of how do I use the tools and the skills that I've learned in school to make change in the community. And I think ethnic studies does a great job of highlighting that.
And to add to both of those comments, when we've worked with our community with regard to the parent dynamic, that sense of agency has been so important, where parents have been so proud of the work, and in many cases we're very keen to say, I wish I'd had a course like this available to me, and fill in the blank, right? Whether that be in high school, whether it be at a community college or a four-year college, and how excited they were for their kids to have that experience, where they could see the importance of the work that's been done by others.
Thank you. Yeah, and I love that angle that you all shared about like the local dimension, because I think to what you said, that the transformative has to make sense to what they're facing, who they are, what are the issues in their communities, right? And I think that happens in ethnic studies, like both in the classroom for them to also be able to do that outside the classroom, right? Connecting that. I'd love if you could share the steps that are being taken to integrate ethnic studies in the K through 12 curriculum.
Yeah, I'll start with that, if that's okay. We started our process at San Luis Coastal shortly after passage of AB 104. Just as a quick recant, that was October 2021, I believe. And so we started that deep dive as early as December 2021 about how to build out our ethnic studies curriculum and our courses of study for the adoption process, so that we understand with AB 104 that you, as a school district in K-12, have to have a course of study at least one semester or 1 year long on your books, so to speak, for 25-26, knowing that it's part of a graduation requirement for the class of 2030. So we began that process in earnest as early as December 2021. Our goal was to bring as many stakeholders to the conversation as possible, to really lay out a process where we had a vision and we wanted to be very transparent in our work. We wanted to be very inclusive. We were going in with our eyes wide open, but also a desire to partner with local community members. We actually partnered with Cal Poly and their ethnic studies department, sought expert advice and opinion. And then we kind of went from there. And we were very blessed that Jane's work with Atosa in our district helped over that period of time. And then we really rolled our sleeves up this last 18 months to dig in to develop the curriculum.
The other piece that I've also seen districts really putting energy and time and thought into is the teacher training piece. So once these courses are developed and developed with so many different voices and so many different people involved in the conversation so that they really are addressing the needs of the local community, then the search is on for who's going to teach these courses and what do we need to do to support those people who are going to step into these classrooms that we want to be unique classrooms, that we want to be really different kind of experiences for a lot of our students. How do we support those teachers in knowing not only this curriculum, because it's a very broad curriculum, very deep curriculum, but how do we support them in knowing how to facilitate these conversations with students that are sometimes difficult, sometimes challenging? So there's a lot of energy, I think, also put to supporting teachers who are going to come into those classrooms. And especially if you know that you are a district with many teachers who are Caucasian, who are going to be coming in and talking to students who are not, and who are, about lives that maybe are not similar to the lives that they've lived. So how do those teachers who are white or teachers of color even prepare themselves to come into these classrooms and engage in that curriculum?
I would also add from a teacher perspective, like the people who teach ethnic studies are brave people. Like out of all of the courses on a high school campus, that is going to be one of the most challenging courses to teach as a teacher because there is so much contention in the wider community about the subject. And I think in addition to having great training, teachers really need support in what they're doing with their students in the classroom in this area so that they can do the work that ethnic studies entails and really honor the field of ethnic studies within the K-12 setting.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then I know you said, the angle of like, how are we going to support now the teachers who are going to be teaching these courses? What are some of the other challenges that you've seen so far or that you foresee in like as this develops?
Well, initially, one of the first challenges that we had to overcome was what ethnic studies is and what it isn't, first and foremost. Speaking to the perspective of bringing teachers into the conversation, finding teachers today at the K-12 level is really problematic, whether that be in English teachers, social studies teachers, math teachers, science. As we dug into the conversation around ethnic studies, would a teacher or would teachers have to have an ethnic studies credential on the out years? Was that something would even be possible? You get into the process piece where students may be asked, that might be part of the A through G requirements to have ethnic studies. Where we landed, reaching out to our teachers in our district at the secondary level, we wanted to leverage funds that were available through the state to partner with Cal Poly. And so what we designed a model where we created a cohort of teachers who actually now enrolled in ethnic studies courses at the university level, K-12 educators to work alongside those in the field to really become content experts whilst also working on the pedagogical approach of how to present. So we see that as the ongoing professional development and an on-the-job training, because as Jane said, they have to be super courageous. The ethnic studies isn't going to lie necessarily in language arts or social studies, but it lies somewhere in between, and it's ever evolving and very fluid. So those are pieces of the puzzle that we thought through at the very beginning.
I think also part of the courage that you've both mentioned is the recognition that these classes are going to be scrutinized, right? So if you are developing this for your district, if you're a teacher of ethnic studies in your community, students at the school, potentially other teachers at the school, other district or school leaders, and absolutely community members are going to be very interested in knowing what that curriculum looks like, what the experiences of the students are. Because I think that in the climate of our world, we understand absolute need for these courses and the value of these courses, but there's also a lot of anxiety on the part of some people in our community about what's being taught in these classes. What are students learning? Is this something that we think is appropriate? Does this make any student communities feel unsafe? And so how do we navigate that as well? So that I think the courage is the teachers, absolutely, but even just like in the process of creating the classes, in the process of delivering those classes, what kind of conversations are we going to need to be prepared for with our families and with our community members? Hopefully really exciting, rich ones.
Another key tension that I see is, it's been really interesting to go through this public review process. So the state of California has said that districts have to create a locally developed ethnic studies curriculum that goes through public review at least 2 times in public comment before it goes to board approval. And so we've tried to be extremely transparent about that process, including posting all of our courses of study online, which not all school districts in the state have done with ethnic studies. However, the challenge is when you get into a classroom, you don't always get to do what you plan that day because you have students in front of you. And so I think about ethnic studies has so many connections to what's going on both in the United States and the world, right? Current events. And students will ask questions and they'll bring up things. And as a teacher, you have to be responsive to that, even if it's not in the document, right, that has been reviewed by the public. So I think for teachers, it's going to be figuring out how to be responsive and relevant and navigate those tensions as they teach.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you spoke to the courageousness, not just of teachers, but of kind of all hands involved. How do you all, or how have you, maybe if you don't mind sharing, like how have you responded to those who may be skeptical or push back a bit, if you've witnessed that?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. One of the things that we haven't said, and that sometimes I feel like is a little bit of an awkward word to use, but I use it, is that ethnic studies is about love. So when people push on curriculum that's been developed, like the curriculum that's been developed is all about affirming people's lived experiences, affirming the wealth and value and beauty of marginalized communities, affirming lived experience, right? So I don't always use that word in meetings with families or district leaders, but sometimes I do, to say this is really about members of our community learning to feel proud of who they are, to love who they are, to have other members of the community maybe who are different than them, to understand them better, to make those connections. I feel like if we can find that common ground in our conversations, the pushback can be more focused on what really the issues or questions or concerns are, and not about ethnic studies broadly. And so I think about anticipating those kinds of concerns, which clearly has been done in San Luis Obispo, but also just thinking about how do we find common ground in the conversations that we have when people do push back or do challenge what we're doing.
I would say in folks that I've talked to who have been more resistant or skeptical of ethnic studies are often coming from a place of, I think, fear and just not knowing what ethnic studies is, right? Like there's a lot of discourse about it as a field. And so sometimes it's taking the opportunity to educate people on what ethnic studies involves, its pedagogy, its aims, that it's not about dividing people, it's actually about creating solidarity between people. And I think that when you have those conversations, people do find that common ground, as you mentioned. But, what's so interesting about this is probably most of us in this room didn't have an ethnic studies class growing up. And so for a lot of people, it's a new subject. Like they just don't know what to do with it yet. But as students experience it at younger ages, specifically with this high school graduation requirement, I think there will be less of the fear of unknown of what it is.
And one of the areas that came to mind when you posed the question for me was a piece of comment that came our way from a member of the community was a parent focus on maybe overcoming and persevering and lifting themselves up in the curriculum that we were talking about and bringing to the board's attention. And we wanted to also, speaking to Jennifer's point about love, it wasn't just about marginalized groups overcoming and persevering. It was about celebration, and it was about love and all the positive pieces. So on the surface level, it might to some appear like ethnic studies is a review of or a discussion around those that are marginalized and how they kind of go unnoticed or whatever it may be. And it's not. And that's the piece as we've delivered and worked with community members and parents. They embrace and celebrate the joy that now they're starting to see themselves in the literature that we're selecting, the units of study that are being developed, and the celebrations of that shared experience.
Right. And to jump off of that, I think absolutely everything you've said is spot on and makes sense. And I go back to the idea of fear, because I think that the other thing that I've heard from students and families and community members is this is going to teach my child to feel bad about him or her themselves, right? And that is so far from the goal of ethnic studies, the curriculum and the pedagogy of ethnic studies, but it's a fear that exists. So I think it's really important to also, I appreciate that you guys have been so transparent in sharing your curriculum, but to like let people see what it really is so that they can let go of that concern, right? It's not about any students in the classroom feeling bad about who they are or feeling bad about their place in our society or their own lived experience. It's about the richness of it and the importance of understanding it and bringing the breadth of it that exists in this country and in the world into the classroom.
I would also add just, having been an English teacher as well, and teaching some books that really engage with ideas that are in ethnic studies courses, is students do have to sit with discomfort as well. Like when students learn the true histories of what people of color have faced in this country, like it's not pretty in a lot of ways. And yes, there has always been resistance to oppression and celebration of culture and joy, but you know, there's a lot of stuff that happens in history that is violent, that is oppressive, and that does make students feel uncomfortable. But I think there's something to learn from that discomfort and to work through that, that it's not necessarily about like me as a white person feeling uncomfortable. I think that's a natural reaction to learning what you're learning sometimes.
Yeah, and to close out on that, I always come back to public education in America is it's a messy thing. And philosophically, our desire is to get students to think and to sit in that messiness. And sometimes there's a level of discomfort, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I really appreciate you all saying that because I'm like, yes, I see this and I teach ethnic studies. I see these exact comments and the kind of reactions and the same kind of responses that discomfort isn't the end of the world. Like discomfort is you sit with it, you process it, and that's the idea I think between the classrooms, right? That they're processing that discomfort together, regardless of what their background or how they identify. I really love what you said about love because I think about bell hooks and about what she writes about love and how a lot of Black feminists, Chicana feminists have written about love as like a form of practice to liberation, right? And I've never thought to use it like that with my students or like, because there is pushback sometimes. Um, but I've also taken the approach of regardless of who your ancestors were, whether they were colonizers or colonized or both, that messy history, and that's the word I use as well with them, is what kind of connects us all, right? For better or for worse, these things happen hundreds of years before any of us were here. And so I like that idea of kind of sitting through the discomfort and the messiness together to kind of look ahead too, right? So that the idea is not to stay uncomfortable or to stay feeling guilty or whatever, but to use that hopefully as fuel to collaborate and work together to move on, to move forward, right?
Can I just interject?
Absolutely.
So I talk a lot to the students and the teachers and administrators that I work with about discomfort being the place from which we grow.
Yeah.
And I compare it to the athlete, right? That in order to be better at the sport that you want to excel in, you have to push yourself to a place where you're uncomfortable, right? You're, in this case, feeling physical pain to move forward, to be stronger. So I talk to students and teachers about the discomfort is uncomfortable, and we've often been taught to run away from it, like prevent it, run away from it. But I ask people to sometimes sit in it and think about what it is that's making them uncomfortable and recognize that the discomfort is the place from which they grow. You get stronger, you build muscles, you develop as a result of that.
Thank you for sharing that. So I want to keep the conversation going. My next question is, how do you envision collaborations between K through 12 schools, community colleges, and universities?
I think we have so many opportunities that we're just starting to build out. Leslie had mentioned this earlier. A year ago, a cohort of teachers and leaders in our district began taking ethnic studies classes through Cal Poly's Department of Ethnic Studies. And so we've taken the four main disciplines. So we started with Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, and then moved through Native American, African American, and are currently in our Latino, Latina, Latinx studies course with Dr. Jose Navarro. And that's to, really build up the knowledge base and pedagogy of the teachers who will likely be teaching the course to start out. But I think there's many different ways we can really expand on that. Just in thinking about like teacher training or opportunities outside of the regular school year for students to take courses. And then drawing on the expertise of our professors at Cuesta, at Cal Poly, because many of our ethnic studies educators to start out with won't have majored in ethnic studies. Like, hopefully we'll get to the point where we can hire ethnic studies majors and credentialed folks in that area. But because this is new, semi-uncharted territory for the whole state, we really need to rely on our post-secondary institutions to help us get to speed, I think.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, I think Sebastian, the partnership, there's so many opportunities as we build together, and bringing whether that be Cal Poly, Cuesta into our schools, because we are sending our students to both institutions. Part of that conversation at the community college or the four-year college will be, what are those ethnic studies courses that students will then matriculate toward as well. And then they become experts, and it's a field that's ever growing and expanding for all the right reasons. And it's a real positive partnership, and we're excited by that. We're just starting to dip our toe in the water, so to speak.
Yeah, when I think about the sort of future of ethnic studies and what it looks like K through 12 or 9 through 12, but it could be, been part of some middle school ethnic studies programs as well. So into community colleges and four-year colleges, it'll be interesting to see, and I think we're a little ways off of this, but like how there's then talk about articulation. What are students learning in K through 12 schools? What are they then needing in community colleges and four-year colleges? And how do we make sure that we're, in a way that makes sense, building on students' skills, students' knowledge, drawing on pedagogical practices that are in the high school and making sure that that's the same kind of approach that builds on that's happening in the college level.
Something I'd also like to add, as I've spoken to a couple of professors who do oral history and other community-based projects to really record the lived experiences of these communities in our area. And I think there's a lot we can do with building archives and other community-based projects with our students that we could use college and university models for on maybe a smaller scale level.
Well, this might kind of build off your response actually. From your experiences, what are some effective strategies that educators can implement to support the needs of students of color?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is validating and valuing and asking students to bring that lived experience into the classroom, right? So I would hope that when students walk into these ethnic studies courses, they feel like this is different than anything that I've had before. I'm allowed to talk about my life. I'm encouraged to talk about my life. I'm encouraged to talk to my family about my family when I come into these spaces, and that I have this opportunity. Again, I think of the participatory action research projects, that I'm like encouraged to build skills that I'm going to take into the community. I'm encouraged to connect to my community in this way. This is not housed just in a classroom, but this class has me thinking more broadly about my place in the world and the place of the other students in the class, and how we can develop things outside of the classroom that improve all of our lives and improve our connections with each other.
Well, I think it also goes to the function of schools in that it's a relational business in a way. And for students to feel seen and heard, and in many instances, it may be the first time they've maybe felt that they're being seen and heard. And that will lead to the empowerment and agency, which is so, so important for them to use as a fuel to fuel them in other areas and to inspire them to make change and be change agents as a result, and to grow the culture and the community, both at their school site, within their group, within the next step in their journey as they leave the K-12 model and come into the world, so to speak, and be an agent for change and be a driver of, all because of the relational nature and feeling validated, empowered as a result of a course. Many of us who are involved in education primarily got involved in education because an adult or a teacher inspired us in some way. It may have actually been a course and a teacher that inspired us. And I would look to the future to say, wow, this could be that moment in time where it's seminal for so many young people to say, wow, that was a moment of change in my trajectory that I didn't see coming. I signed up for a course, or I had to take this course, and all of a sudden it was transformational. So we're excited about that.
I think I would add to thinking about local context. So it's interesting how the student demographics in San Luis Obispo, I'll just call the city specifically, are not representative of the demographics throughout the state of California. And so our students are majority white. I think it's about 60% or so, and at the high school at least, and 30% Latino. And so when you're discussing these different groups and experiences, sometimes you might have one Black student in the class. And so there's a sense of, I think, students feeling intense pressure when those things get discussed because they might be the only one, or maybe they're only two who share that identity. And so thinking about within our own context about how to make the classroom a safe space for those students when it is a majority white classroom, I think is really important. And then also speaking with our students about how like this isn't actually representative of the full state. It's different depending on where you go, right? So I think your experience as a student of ethnic studies can be really dependent on the makeup of your classroom too. And to just share with students those kind of ideas, have them talk about it, think about what educational justice and culturally relevant education looks like in their own classrooms and schools, is really important for empowering students of color. Working with the AVID program, which in our area is majority Latino, it's very much about saying like building community between those students and empowering them to be leaders on campus, because I know that there are a lot of times they don't feel seen until they're able to come together and really talk about what's important to them.
And it's really interesting to think about sort of how to design these classes, right? Because you speak about San Luis Obispo, even within our county, the different high schools will have very different populations. So while there is the model curriculum and you can draw from that as a resource, schools want to be responsive to who their students are and make sure that those students have curriculum that speaks to who they are. And so even within our county, it's going to be a challenge for each high school to say, what does our curriculum look like? Because it's not going to be identical, much less the state of California, right, where it's going to be varied across schools and districts. So I think that's just another one of the challenges that we face and that schools and districts face in designing these courses for students.
And one thing this wasn't on the list, but a question I'm thinking about, just because you mentioned adapting your course, teaching ethnic studies will look different depending on where you're regionally, geographically located. I see that here as well, right? Sometimes you're teaching ethnic studies to a predominantly white student or classroom. I'm curious, and then I know you all have different roles, but I'm curious, like, if you don't mind sharing, how you all navigate your own kind of positionalities in being advocates for this. Because I imagine that there are other teachers and other educators and folks in education who will also, kind of face these things. So if you'd like to speak on that at all.
In my role as a secondary director, a former high school principal, and a former social studies teacher, very delicately, because we have to walk that fine line of impartiality, but at the same time, you're coming into the world of education with a sense of empathy and desire to be impactful toward young people. I often say we go into education because we love it. We didn't go in because we got stock options. We have to love what we're doing. And our heart cries out for a lot of times those that are marginalized and are not seen. And, a friend of mine always said, it's important to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I always think that resonates real well. And so sometimes you got to be bold, and you got to be willing to take those risks, because students are looking for that leadership as well. But definitely it is a very fine line, because I think Jen said at best at the very beginning, we're just starting on the journey. There's going to be those in the out years that are going to view certain areas, certain topics as being controversial or make controversy that's outside of our control. But what's inside of our control is being authentic with our students and being genuine and true to making a difference. That's how I try and navigate it.
I guess I would tell a story a little bit. So I've been visiting a lot of different groups in our district to talk about our ethnic studies curriculum and get their feedback. And I went to a class of juniors, an AVID class, mostly Latino students. And I was talking to them about the curriculum and asking them for feedback. And one of the young women raises her hand and I call on her and she says, I don't want to offend you. And I said, girl, I'm a high school teacher. You can't offend me. Heard everything, right? And she says, I think this is great. It's really important to me, but I just wish there were more teachers from the Latino community who like represented me. And I was like, that is certainly not offensive to me, right? But I do think that's an issue, right? Our students want to see themselves represented in authority positions. And that's real and important and work that we need to do. And also, like, white educators need to do the work too. And so it's thinking about, like, how can we center voices of color and educators, but also there is a place for white people in ethnic studies to do that work with students. And so I guess in my positionality, right? It's like I could sit here and be quiet about it and not be involved in the work, and that would be very comfortable for me, and okay. But then I'm not doing anything. And so I think it's that balance of not being the center stage all the time, but still getting involved in doing the work for the students.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I think about this personally and professionally a lot, right? When I sit on a stage like this, I think about it. When I step in front of a group of educators, I think about it. When I'm working with students and developing curriculum, I think about it. And I think about it, like I said, I think about it a lot. It doesn't take people pointing it out to me for me to be like, I am acutely aware of this. The thing that I feel like I make an effort to bring into every space that I step into is humility. And I think the reality for all of us, including the students who are going to be in these classes and the teachers who are going to be teaching these classes, is that we don't know what we don't know, right? So I've lived a life in this body, in the communities that I've been in. You know, I didn't choose it. I lived this life that I was placed into. And so I think a lot about how I need to constantly be aware of that, of what my privilege is, how my privilege has lived, you know, in my experience, how it affects what I do, how it affects the way that I see things. Be willing to have people point that out to me, again, even if it's uncomfortable, to try to just have humility in thinking about my life experience is my life experience, and there are going to be a lot of people that I'm working with who have different life experiences, and I want to learn from them and I want to grow. And this goes back to what I'd said before about the teacher training. I think it's critically important that if there are going to be white teachers teaching ethnic studies, that they learn about their own privilege, that they do everything they can to sort of remove that veil. I sometimes talk to students and faculty about the fish bowls that we live in. Like that I didn't even realize for a long part of my life that there were other fish bowls that were different than mine. I'm so much living in that space that I was raised in that I don't even always recognize the differences. I think it's critical for people who are going to lead ethnic studies programs and teach ethnic studies classes to do everything that they can on their own to discover what that veil is for themselves, to see the lives in the other fish bowls and to begin to understand those. And that allows a teacher then to come into the classroom ready to learn themselves, ready to facilitate the kinds of conversations and work that they're asking their students to do, ready also to learn and grow themselves.
What I would also add, and this is what I love about ethnic studies, is these are conversations we get to have with students in the classroom too, that I don't know that we would have had them anywhere else. Maybe in English class, maybe social studies, but there's just not as much of a space for it, I think, in the curriculum in those courses. And so as you were talking about that, I was thinking about, you know, when we talk about identity, like some things are visible and some things are not. And also thinking about your self-perception versus societal perception. My husband is dual ethnic. His father is Mexican. His mother's white from Iowa. And he is often perceived as white, but he doesn't see himself that way. That's not how he identifies. And there's often conflict even within himself of how sometimes Latino people don't view him as Latino because of how light his skin is. And so I think you can have those conversations with students about the complexities of identity, how we view them ourselves, how other people's perception of ourselves affects how we feel about ourselves. And I just think that's really beautiful to be able to talk about that in the classroom in a way that I don't think we've been doing before.
Thank you. I really appreciate each of your responses for that. And I'm sure folks in the audience and in Zoom as well. And I think you're right that like that's the point too in ethnic studies, to the transparency and the vulnerability, not just of the students, but of the instructors as well. I mean, that's I think that collaboration, again, not just among students, but collaboration as a community for all participants in the space, right? Did you want to respond?
I just wanted to, like, as you're talking, I even think that if the teacher is not willing to be vulnerable in that way in the space, that compromises the success of that space. So like that confidence, comfort, willingness to be vulnerable on the part of the teacher in those classrooms is a big piece of what makes them the beautiful spaces that we hope them to be.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, before we wrap up today, I do want to make time for questions. If there's questions in the room, or if there are questions, I don't know how let me come over here and check on Zoom. Oh, I think I see one. Okay, I have an anonymous question here. It says, our district is beginning to incorporate cross-curricular ethnic studies courses. What advice would you give a high school teacher that has to create the curriculum for a Spanish class with an ethnic studies emphasis in regard to designing and balancing both language content and everything that is ethnic studies?
That is a tall order, honestly. I don't know what level Spanish it is because I can't imagine just teaching the basics of it. But I think that the advice that I would give in that circumstance is to not do it alone. To really try to seek out a coalition of either other teachers or teachers and district leaders to support that curriculum building work. And also to say, like, the California Department of Education's model curriculum is helpful in seeing many of the different courses of study that have been developed across the state in the past. Because there have been many school districts that have offered these courses. Thinking about, I think there was one that I saw that was for English language development. That was also an ethnic studies course that might be interesting to look at, as well as, there's Chicano literature courses taught in Spanish. It's hard to know without knowing the Spanish level, but I think there are some models for that to look at.
Yeah, and I would echo that and add perhaps a conversation with your site leadership team, to be honest, about the complexity of trying to do Spanish and ethnic studies well. I've heard, as we've sat here, the joy of being able to sit in the space and to create agency and to allow people to be seen and to have time to be in that messy world, and whilst also trying to teach Spanish is really difficult. So I would ask respectfully for that teacher in that situation to reach out to their site leadership team to say, I need you to help me because this is too tall of an order task by myself. And as Jane said, you're looking for support, and you can't work in isolation because it doesn't do justice to the students and it doesn't serve the course and the tenets of the course. And you can look at the resources available on the CD website. And yes, you can look at all of the drop down courses that have been approved and you can find some inspiration. But are you really, really supporting the ethos of ethnic studies and why we're really doing the work that we're doing? So that would be my thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to sort of third that reach out, I think you're absolutely right about, like, if this is a squish in, like we're going to take a class that already exists and push ethnic studies into it, it probably isn't going to serve you or serve your students. That said, if it's something that you need to do, I would encourage you to reach out. One of the beautiful things about ethnic studies is that I feel like people are so excited to share. So reach out to ethnic studies professors, connect to San Francisco State, reach out to the ethnic studies program here at Cuesta. Like, lots of people would be willing to problem solve with you and help you do this design.
Thank you, folks. And I see we have a question in the room. Sir, would you like to?
Yeah, my issue, I've been sitting there watching, the whole, situation here. And, when you talk about, first of all, history, why do we have to have ethnic studies instead of having world history where you put everybody in it? Because when you don't do that, you reinforcing white supremacy, because history is white supremacy history. And you make everybody take white supremacy history, and then you're gonna say, oh, and you have an option to take ethnic studies. Now, Where is that going to lead to? Where's that going to go? Where's that going to go? All it's going to do is get pushed back from all the people that said, oh, we just need to have white supremacy or world history. Why do we need to worry about this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth? So to have this conversation is to reinforce white supremacy. What do y'all think about that?
I appreciate that question so much, but as you're talking, I'm thinking it's not an and or, it's a both, right? So
Yeah,
we
that's my
need to
issue.
change the
That's my
the
issue.
content of the history.
That's my issue. That's my issue. That's what I'm saying. So I'm sitting here listening to a conversation that, they're saying either or, in the sense, that says that we're going to make everybody learn white supremacy history, and then we're going to give you an option to learn about 80% of the world. White people are only 14% of the population, and 85% of the world are people of color, and we got to sit up here and take white supremacy history and then say, we're going to let you learn about the 85% of the world in a little class that you can take on the side instead of putting it in world history and teaching everybody the truth instead of teaching them to be white supremacists, to support white privilege and to support a country, that was built on colonialism and European, that's what y'all teach. White supremacy, colonialized fucking history. And y'all need to quit that.
Can I add my comment to that, if you don't mind? Let me kind of, if I may ditto and rephrase what he's saying, is the sense that what is taught in world history is really based on a principality, like what he's saying, of white supremacy. And you could even see in the history books, they put, pictures of white manifest destiny. And the thing is, what he's trying to say, and what I would agree with, is that really, if you look at it, this should originate in a world history class. You're taught world history in 8th grade, but the thing is, you're not really taught true world history. You're taught the white supremacist version of history. And if if we were taught the full version of history, which is he's saying is about 80+% people of color and ethnicity like himself and myself, that would cover a lot of the holes. And so what's happening in ethnic studies is all that stuff of white supremacy is left out of the world history class. People don't know about it. And then what you do is you try to tag it on at the end of the last 100, 200 years and say, oh, all of a sudden we have issues with racism and stuff like that. No, this dates all the way back. You could go a good 1,000, 2,000 years. So I'm going to agree with this gentleman is saying here. I think he brings up a great point, is that the beginning and core of this starts with a solid world history class that shows that what's been happening in the world was white supremacy, as well as white manifest destiny here in the United States. Carry that out as long as you can, and that will actually bridge the gaps that what we're trying to bridge here in ethnic studies classes. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Are there any responses to that? Okay, sure.
When I said both and, what I meant was, I think there's a value to ethnic studies classes as they're designed, and as we'll be implementing this. And I also see so many of the ethnic studies teachers working also to push for changes in the history curriculum. They are tied together. Absolutely. So I see those two things happening at the same time. I also wanted to mention, I don't know, I feel like I assume people know, but it's not necessarily the case. Starting in 2030, ethnic studies will be required for high school graduation. So it's not a course that students can elect not to take. It'll be a course that they'll be required to take. But as I said, I think that these are like, yes, changes absolutely need to be made to the history curriculum starting in 1st grade. And I believe that ethnic studies courses need to be part of the curriculum, and that ethnic studies advocates, teachers, curriculum developers, district staff are working to push for changes in the, whatever the American history, US history curriculum looks like, so that curriculum is real, right? Is telling a real story and not a a story that's only one perspective and leaves out the truth.
Yeah, thank you. And I think even to that point too, like it's not just world history, it's also like STEM fields. It's also like English, right? Like white supremacy manifests in virtually every subject area. And people don't think that, you know, a math class you can be a class where you're teaching about like racism or how to dismantle it, right? And there's, I think, with creativity, with vision, with intention, you could be teaching that those all of those areas, I think, from that perspective, right? In ways that makes sense for students in their local community, makes sense for them on their journey, because it shouldn't just be ethnic studies. I think I definitely agree with that, right? I think the idea would be that we're doing those changes kind of broadly. And I think that also then brings the question of then those teachers would still need to be trained to teach it history or English in those ways. I think we are just about out of time. So I want to say thank you to all three of you for being here and for sharing your knowledge and your experiences. And for those who are here in the room and on Zoom, thank you. And I think that concludes our panel today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.